three-act story. The Hollow Men of Badger's Drift. Act 3, Breaking the Pact. The Circle Unbroken. The forest was no longer just a forest. It felt alive, shifting with an intent Avery couldn't ignore. Every twisted branch clawed at him like skeletal hands. Every step echoed like a drumbeat, urging him forward and deeper into the unknown. The black shard in his hand grew colder, its strange carvings pulsing faintly as if responding to the encroaching darkness. He didn't know how far he'd run. Time felt warped here, the hours stretching and collapsing all at once. The fog thickened, clinging to his skin and muffling the sounds of the hollow men behind him. Their ember-like eyes, flickering faintly through the haze, were his only markers of pursuit. A sudden rustle snapped him from his daze. His instincts flared, and he whirled around, shining the flashlight into the mist. The beam caught movement, a spindly limb retreating into the shadows. "Still here," Avery muttered, his breath visible in the frigid air. Ahead the forest began to change. The trees grew farther apart, their bark darkened and split as if burned. The ground sloped upward, revealing a faint trail carved into the hillside. There was something unnatural about this place, as if the land itself had been touched by whatever force bound the hollow men. The shard in his hand flared suddenly, its light growing stronger as he neared the hill's crest. Avery slowed, his heart hammering in his chest. He had no plan, only the desperate hope that whatever was drawing him here could provide answers, or, at the very least, an escape. When he reached the top he froze. The hill flattened into a wide plateau, its center dominated by an enormous stone circle. These stones were larger than those he'd seen before, towering and cracked, their surfaces glowing faintly with intricate carvings. The patterns pulsed in rhythm with the shard in Avery's hand, their glow growing brighter as if responding to his presence. Around the circle the fog seemed to part, swirling and twisting unnaturally, held at bay by the strange energy emanating from the stones. Avery stepped forward, his footsteps crunching against the brittle grass. The air here felt heavier, charged with an electric tension that made his skin crawl. As he approached the center of the circle, the shard in his hand began to vibrate, its coldness biting into his palm. He stopped at the edge of the stones, his breath catching in his throat. Carvings of twisted figures and spirals covered the monoliths, eerily similar to the designs he'd seen in the church and on the shard itself. But these carvings seemed alive. They shifted and writhed, the stone appearing to ripple like water as the light within the patterns pulsed. A low hum filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. It wasn't just a sound, it was a vibration that resonated through Avery's bones, making him feel as though the ground itself was alive. "This is it," he whispered, unsure if he was speaking to himself or the shard. The hum grew into a deep, resonant tone, and then the carvings flared with blinding light. Avery staggered back, shielding his eyes. When the light dimmed, the air in the circle was no longer empty. Figures began to materialize, their forms half real and shimmering like heat haze. They were tall, gaunt, and skeletal, with the same ember eyes as the hollow men. But these figures were different, less corporeal, more like shadows wearing the guise of men. Avery's pulse raced as the realization hit him. These weren't just any hollow men. These were their origin, their essence. The spirits bound to this cursed pact. One of the figures stepped forward, its movements fluid and unsettling. When it spoke, its voice was a low guttural hiss, like the wind through dead leaves. "The shard calls to us," it said, the words resonating inside Avery's head rather than through the air. "You hold the key to what was broken." "What do you mean?" Avery stammered, his voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, ember eyes flickering. "The pact was forged here," the figure said, its voice resonating with an unnatural weight. A bond between the living and the unseen. It was a balance, a sacrifice to protect the village from forces beyond comprehension. But the pact was broken. Avery swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the shard. "I didn't break anything. I don't even know why I'm here." Another figure stepped forward, its skeletal form flickering in and out of focus. The sins of the past echo through the bloodlines. The pact was bound by the hands of your ancestors. You bear their burden now. What do you mean, my ancestors? Avery asked, his voice rising in panic. The first figure raised a spindly hand, pointing toward the center of the stone circle. The glowing carvings flared brighter, illuminating an altar-like structure at the circle's heart. Upon it rested a large black stone, its surface etched with the same intricate spirals as the shard in Avery's hand. The hollow men are bound to this place, the figure said. We cannot leave until the pact is restored. Avery stepped closer to the altar, drawn by a force he couldn't explain. The shard in his hand grew warmer, pulsing in time with the carvings on the altar. What happens if I restore it? He asked cautiously. The figures shifted, their forms growing darker and more menacing. The balance will be returned, one of them said. The hollow men will be satisfied. But the sacrifice must be made. Avery's stomach dropped. Sacrifice? What kind of sacrifice? The figures didn't answer immediately. Instead, the carvings on the altar flared, projecting images into the air, visions of the past. Avery saw a group of villagers, their faces pale with fear, surrounding the altar. A man and a woman, bound and gagged, were forced to kneel before the black stone. The villagers chanted in unison, their voices a haunting melody. The black stone absorbed their cries, glowing brighter until the captives collapsed, lifeless. Avery staggered back, horror flooding his veins. No, no way, I'm not doing that. You must, one of the figures hissed. The pact demands it. Without it, the hollow men will consume everything. A chill ran through Avery as the meaning became clear. The sacrifices had to be human. There has to be another way, he shouted, his voice cracking. The figures loomed closer, their ember eyes burning brighter. The pact is clear, blood for peace. Break it, and the hollow men will not stop with the village. They will spread. They will devour. The fog around the circle thickened, and Avery felt the oppressive weight of their presence bearing down on him. His mind raced, searching for a solution, a way out of this nightmare. Then he remembered the journal. The man's words came back to him. The pact can be broken if the stone itself is destroyed. He looked down at the shard in his hand, its light now pulsing furiously. Could this piece of the altar be the key to ending it all? What if I destroy the stone? Avery demanded, his voice trembling but resolute. The figures recoiled, their forms flickering violently. The hum in the air grew louder, angrier. You would dare? One of them snarled. To destroy the anchor is to unbind us all. Chaos would reign. You cannot comprehend the consequences. Avery felt the weight of their anger pressing against him, but he also saw something else in their reaction, fear. Destroying the stone might not just free the village. It might free these entities as well, unleashing them fully into the world. But what choice did he have? The alternative was to continue the cycle of blood and sacrifice, to let the hollow men haunt and kill in perpetuity. He took a step toward the altar, raising the shard in his hand. The glowing carvings pulsed faster, as if reacting to his intent. The figures surged forward, their forms darkening, their ember eyes blazing. Stop, one of them roared, its voice shaking the ground. You will doom them all. Avery hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. Was he truly prepared to take this risk? To gamble with forces he didn't understand? The fog around the circle thickened, swirling violently. The hollow men outside the stone circle shrieked, their voices piercing the air as they clawed at the boundary, desperate to break through. And then from the mist a familiar voice called out, Avery, don't! He spun around, his eyes widening as he saw the man from the woods stumbling into the circle. Blood stained his clothes, and his face was pale and drawn, but he was alive. They're lying to you, the man shouted, his voice hoarse but insistent. Destroying the stone won't end it, it'll only make them stronger. Avery froze, his mind spinning. The figures turned toward the man, their ember eyes narrowing. Silence the interloper, one of them growled. The ground beneath the man's feet cracked, dark tendrils of fog snaking up to ensnare him. He struggled, his voice strained but defiant. Avery, listen to me. The journal, the answer isn't destruction, it's in the binding. You have to complete the ritual, but with them in the circle. It's the only way to trap them forever. The figures hissed in fury, their forms growing darker and more menacing. The air vibrated with their anger, and Avery felt as though the very fabric of reality was beginning to unravel. He stood at the center of the storm, the shard in his hand glowing brighter than ever. Two choices lay before him: to destroy the stone and risk unleashing the hollow men, or to trust the man and attempt the ritual, gambling on a chance to bind them once and for all. The ground trembled violently as the figures advanced, their ember eyes fixed on Avery. Time was running out. Act 3, Restoring Balance, the Ritual's Gamble. The air buzzed with an oppressive energy as Avery stood at the edge of the stone circle. The shard in his hand pulsed frantically as though urging him to act, but his mind churned with doubt. Two voices echoed in his head, one urging destruction, the other pleading for caution. The man's last words rang loudest. Complete the ritual with them in the circle. It's the only way to trap them forever. The hollow men loomed closer, their skeletal forms flickering like dying flames. Their ember eyes burned with fury, and their whispers coiled around him like snakes, insidious and relentless. The interloper lies, one hissed. Destroy the shard, and your torment ends. Complete the ritual, and you will be cursed as we are, another snarled, its voice cutting through the thickening mist. Avery clenched his jaw, his gaze darting between the altar and the swirling fog beyond the stones. The man's warning weighed heavy in his chest. If he destroyed the stone, he might unleash something far worse than the hollow men. But completing the ritual would mean facing them head-on, and the prospect of failure was just as terrifying. A piercing shriek shattered the air. Avery spun around to see the man struggling against the dark tendrils that had ensnared him. They tightened around his limbs, dragging him closer to the edge of the circle. Avery, the man cried, his voice strained. Do it. Don't listen to them. The hollow men surged forward, their forms distorting into jagged shadows. The boundary of the stone circle flared with light, holding them at bay, but it flickered dangerously as if their combined will was beginning to overpower it. Avery gripped the shard tightly, its cold surface biting into his palm. His decision had to come now. He stepped toward the altar. The hollow men let out an unearthly wail, their ember eyes blazing with fury. You dare defy us? One roared, its voice splitting the air like thunder. Avery ignored them, focusing on the symbols carved into the black stone. The shard in his hand pulsed in time with the glowing spirals, and he realized what he had to do. The shard wasn't just a fragment of the altar, it was a key. He pressed the shard into a groove on the altar's surface. It fit perfectly, clicking into place as if it had always belonged there. The reaction was immediate. The carvings on the stone flared with blinding light, and a low resonant hum filled the air. The vibrations surged through the ground, shaking the stones and forcing the hollow men to recoil. The fog outside the circle twisted violently, coiling into massive, writhing tendrils. The hollow men shrieked, their forms flickering erratically as the light from the altar grew brighter. The man's voice broke through the chaos. You need to bind them. Use the words, they're in the journal. The journal. Avery's heart sank as he realized he'd left it behind in the woods. Panic bubbled in his chest, but then he remembered the fragments he'd read. Snatches of the ritual came back to him, half-formed and uncertain, but it was all he had. He placed both hands on the altar, feeling the energy surge through his body. The carvings on the stone seemed to ripple beneath his touch, as if responding to his intent. Closing his eyes, he began to speak. The bond is formed, the circle sealed, shadows bound by stone and will. His voice wavered, but the altar reacted, its glow intensifying. The hollow men screamed, their forms twisting as if dragged toward the center of the circle. You cannot bind us, one howled, its ember eyes blazing with defiance. Your words are weak. Your resolve will fail. Avery gritted his teeth, forcing himself to continue. The words felt clumsy and incomplete, but the altar responded, its light pulsing in rhythm with his voice. By pact and promise, by blood and bone, your ties are severed. Return to stone! The circle erupted in a cascade of light, the force so powerful that Avery was thrown backward. The hollow men were dragged closer to the altar, their forms disintegrating into streams of black mist. Their screams filled the air, deafening and inhuman, as they fought against the pull. But the light began to falter. The carvings on the stones dimmed, and the mist around the circle surged inward, coiling around the altar like a living thing. The hollow men regained their footing, their ember eyes glowing brighter as they pushed back against the ritual's pull. Your binding is incomplete, one bellowed, its voice a guttural roar. You lack the final sacrifice. Avery's stomach dropped. Final sacrifice. The journal's fragmented words came rushing back. The binding requires blood. His blood. The shard pulsed in his hand, its cold surface now searing hot. Avery stared at it, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Was he truly willing to go this far? To spill his own blood to end this nightmare? The man's voice cut through the chaos, desperate and hoarse. Avery, it's the only way, the hollow men surged forward, their forms coalescing into a massive writhing shadow that loomed over the altar. Their ember eyes burned like fire, and their voices echoed in unison. You cannot escape the price. All must pay in the end. Avery looked down at the shard, its surface glowing with an intensity that made his hand tremble. He raised it, the jagged edge catching the light. His pulse thundered in his ears as he pressed the shard to his palm, the sharp edge biting into his skin. Pain flared, sharp and immediate, but he didn't stop. Blood dripped onto the altar, staining the carvings and spreading like ink. The reaction was instant. The altar erupted with light, a blinding beam that shot into the sky and pierced the fog. The hollow men screamed, their forms unraveling as the light consumed them. The ground beneath the circle cracked and shifted, the stones trembling as if the earth itself was rejecting the entities. The mist coiled tighter, dragging the hollow men toward the altar. Their voices rose in a final desperate wail before they were pulled into the light, their forms disintegrating into nothingness. The circle fell silent. Avery collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving. The shard lay on the altar, its glow fading to nothing. The carvings on the stones were dark, their energy spent. The fog began to lift, revealing the forest bathed in the pale light of dawn. The oppressive weight in the air was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. Avery looked around, his vision blurry, but clear enough to see the man staggering toward him. He reached out, his voice weak but steady. "You did it," the man said, his tone filled with awe. "You actually did it," but Avery wasn't sure. The light may have banished the hollow men, but deep in his chest he felt a lingering unease, as if the forest was still watching, still waiting. And somewhere deep beneath the altar something stirred. Act 3, the price of peace. A quiet that never lasts. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet. Not the comforting stillness of dawn breaking over the woods, but a hollow, uneasy silence. Avery knelt by the altar, his bloodied hand trembling as he clutched the shard. Its glow had faded completely, leaving behind a cold, lifeless husk of stone. The man crouched beside him, his face pale and his breath ragged. He surveyed the broken stones and charred ground around the circle, his expression a mix of exhaustion and cautious relief. "I think you've done it," he said, his voice hushed. "The hollow men are gone." Avery didn't respond immediately. He stared at the altar, his mind replaying the last few moments in vivid detail. The screams, the light, the searing pain as his blood soaked the ancient carvings. It had worked. The hollow men had been pulled into the stone, their twisted forms unraveled by the ritual. But something about the silence gnawed at him. It wasn't peace, it was absence. "I don't feel like it's over," Avery muttered, finally breaking the silence. The man turned to him, frowning. "What do you mean, they're gone?" "You saw them disappear." Avery shook his head, his gaze fixed on the altar. "They didn't just disappear, they were taken, pulled into the stone. What happens to them now? The man didn't answer, and his silence was telling. Avery rose unsteadily to his feet, his legs shaking beneath him. He stepped closer to the altar, the weight of the shards still heavy in his palm. The carvings on the black pages border stone were dark now, lifeless, but the air around it still carried a faint charge, like the lingering hum of an electrical current. Avery reached out cautiously, his fingers hovering over the surface. The man grabbed his arm. "Don't," he warned, his voice low and urgent. "You've done enough." "It's over." Avery pulled back, his hand dropping to his side. He wanted to believe it, to accept that the nightmare had ended, but doubt twisted in his gut. He glanced at the stones surrounding the circle. Their carvings, once glowing with an otherworldly light, were now dull, cracked, and weathered as if centuries of decay had caught up with them in an instant. The forest around them, too, seemed off. The mist had cleared, but the trees appeared brittle, their branches drooping unnaturally, like they'd borne witness to something they couldn't forget. Avery turned to the man, his voice sharp. "What happens now? What happens to—" "Whatever's still in there," the man hesitated, his face shadowed with unease. "The stone was always meant to bind, to contain. That's all it's ever done." "But for how long?" Avery pressed, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "We're not just talking about a couple of restless spirits. Those things are something else. If they're still in there, what stops them from getting out again?" The man looked away, his jaw tightening. "The pact worked for centuries. It held them before, and it'll hold them now, as long as no one tampers with it." Avery's chest tightened. The weight of the man's words, "as long as no one tampers with it," felt heavier than the stone itself. "That's not exactly comforting," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. The man shrugged helplessly. "It's all we've got. It's all anyone's ever had." A low rumble rolled through the ground beneath their feet, faint but unmistakable. Avery stiffened, his heart racing as he looked back at the altar. The stone was motionless, but the faint hum in the air was back, growing stronger. "You hear that?" Avery asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man nodded slowly, his face pale. "I do." The rumble grew louder, the vibrations creeping up through Avery's legs and into his chest. He took an instinctive step back, clutching the shard tighter. "What's happening?" Avery demanded, his voice sharp with panic. The man stumbled backward, his eyes wide with dread. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice trembling. "It shouldn't be doing this. The ritual should have sealed it for good." The altar began to glow faintly, the cracks in its surface emanating a sickly green light. A deep, resonant hum filled the air, growing louder and more oppressive with each passing second. The circle of stones that had once been their shield now seemed fragile, like brittle bones ready to snap. Avery's breath came in short bursts as he took another step back. "You said this was the only way," he said, his voice rising in accusation. "You said this would stop them." "It should have!" the man shouted, his desperation spilling over. "This isn't supposed to happen." The ground beneath the altar split open with a deafening crack, and a plume of dark mist erupted from the fissure, spiraling into the air like an uncoiling serpent. The mist churned, twisting into shapes that were horrifyingly familiar, jagged, skeletal figures with ember eyes that burned brighter than ever. The hollow men hadn't been destroyed. They'd been waiting. Avery staggered back, his mind racing. The ritual hadn't worked as intended. Instead of binding the hollow men, it had given them something new, something stronger. The mist solidified into a towering figure, far larger than the hollow men they'd faced before. Its body was a mass of shifting shadows, its eyes blazing like twin suns. When it spoke, its voice was a cacophony of whispers and roars. "You thought you could bind us again," it said, the words rippling through the air. "But your blood has awakened what lay beneath. You have freed us from servitude." Avery's stomach turned to ice, freed. The word hung in the air like a death knell. The man grabbed Avery's arm, his voice urgent. "We need to go now." Avery didn't need convincing. The two of them bolted, their feet pounding against the forest floor as the towering figure unleashed an ear-splitting howl. The sound reverberated through the trees, shattering branches and sending flocks of unseen birds screeching into the sky. As they ran, Avery felt the weight of the shard in his pocket. He'd taken it instinctively before fleeing, and now its presence felt like both a curse and a lifeline. It had connected him to the ritual, to the altar, and maybe to the hollow men themselves. "What do we do now?" Avery shouted, his voice nearly drowned out by the chaos behind them. The man didn't answer immediately. His face was etched with fear, his breaths ragged. "We find the journal. There has to be something we missed." "Some way to stop this!" Avery cursed under his breath. The journal left behind in their mad dash to the stone circle felt like an eternity away. But if there was any chance it held answers, they had no choice. Behind them, the towering figure of shadow began to move. It didn't chase them on foot, but seemed to flow through the forest like a storm cloud, its ember eyes locked on them. The mist that had dissipated earlier now surged back, coiling through the trees and cutting off any semblance of an escape route. The man stumbled, falling to his knees with a sharp cry. Avery skidded to a stop, turning back to help him. "Get up!" he yelled, grabbing the man's arm and pulling him to his feet. "It's too fast," the man gasped, his face pale. "We'll never make it." Avery shook his head, determination flaring despite the panic clawing at his chest. "We don't stop, we keep going." The words felt hollow even as he said them. The presence behind them was overwhelming, its power tangible, like the weight of a storm pressing down on his shoulders. As they broke through the tree line into a clearing, Avery spotted a familiar shape ahead, a crumbling stone structure partially obscured by overgrowth. It was the place where they'd first found the journal. "There!" Avery shouted, dragging the man forward. The figure of shadow roared behind them, its ember eyes blazing as the mist surged faster, closing the distance. The clearing was no sanctuary, it was a trap. Reaching the ruins, Avery dove inside, pulling the man with him. The air inside was damp and cold, the scent of decay thick and oppressive. Avery's eyes scanned the floor, desperate to find the journal amid the scattered debris. "There!" the man shouted, pointing to a torn, leather-bound book lying near a crumbled column. Avery scrambled toward it, snatching it up with trembling hands. As he flipped through the pages, the voice of the shadow figure echoed through the ruins. "You cannot hide, you cannot escape. The blood binds you to us." The words chilled Avery to his core. The blood. His blood spilled on the altar had connected him to the hollow men in a way he didn't yet understand. Frantically, he scanned the journal's pages, looking for anything that could explain what had gone wrong. His eyes landed on a passage he'd skimmed over before, one written in shaky handwriting. "The stone does not destroy, it only holds. To sever the bond, one must confront the source of the pact, the one who made it." Avery's hands trembled. The source of the pact. That wasn't the hollow men. It was something deeper, something older. He looked at the man, his voice shaking. This wasn't about them. It was about whoever or whatever bound them in the first place. The man's face drained of color. "You're saying there's something worse." A low guttural laugh filled the air, resonating from the mist outside. "He understands," the shadow figure said, its voice dripping with malice. "You have only just begun to see the truth. You cannot bind what was never meant to be bound." The mist began to seep into the ruins, curling around their feet like icy tendrils. Avery clutched the journal to his chest, his mind racing. "What do we do?" the man whispered, his voice barely audible. Avery didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the journal, on the words that seemed to mock him, even as they offered a glimmer of hope. To confront the source is to risk everything, but it is the only way to end the cycle. May all come full circle. The shadow figure loomed in the entrance, its ember eyes glowing brighter than ever. Its form seemed to shift and grow, filling the space with an oppressive darkness. Avery met its gaze, his fear replaced by a grim resolve. "We end this," he said, his voice steady. The figure laughed again, the sound reverberating through the ruins. "You cannot end what has always been," it said, "but you can join it." The mist surged forward, and the light in the clearing dimmed, leaving only the glow of the shadow's eyes and the faint ominous hum of the stone in Avery's pocket. The mist surged forward, engulfing them in a suffocating embrace. Avery squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable, but instead of the expected pain, he felt a strange sensation, a tingling warmth spreading through his body, followed by a dizzying rush. When he opened his eyes, the ruins had vanished. He stood alone in a vast star-strewn void, the shadow figure looming before him, its form shifting and growing until it consumed the entire expanse. "You have chosen wisely," the shadow's voice boomed, echoing through the void. "To join us is, woe, to transcend your mortal limitations." Avery felt a strange sense of calm descend upon him. The fear, the desperation, all seemed to melt away, replaced by a sense of acceptance. His eyes peeled back and was open to the wonders of the spirit verse for the first time. Indescribable colors, combinations of shapes and patterns, and as his breath wheezed in cold and thin, he knew he had somehow reached the peak of some unfathomable mountain, and bared witness to the pulse of creation. Everything now, then, and maybe, all made sense, and the map of his life danced around him as golden threads. They were strewn by other strings, crimson in color, pulling them this way and the other, forming coherent paths, all the paths, all his paths, and at last being bathed in the light of creation and entropy itself. The shells of ignorance fell from his eyes, and Avery knew as the map of his life knotted into a tight ball, a mess of threads, ropes, and frays, that this moment had been inevitable. He traced his fingers back and forth over the glowing gold threads, here and there, realizing the circular point at which all his possibilities converged in one nodule, spun stiff and sure into a circle. Then a single thick rope, glowing patchy and ominous, as though shown under a black light, spread forwards in front of him. It glowed pale blue, shimmers of green winking across its emerging paths, endlessly branching out into complex tangles and nets in front of him, into an infinite void of blackness, far beyond the capabilities of his revelation. And as Avery had come to know himself, he finally understood the nature of that man. He was the stranger, and Avery had fallen into his designs. He reached out a hand towards the shadow, a smile gracing his lips. "I accept," he whispered, and as his hand touched the swirling darkness, he felt himself dissolve, merging with the shadow, becoming one with the void. The pact was complete. All come full circle. All fates that led to nowhere, but here, collapsing under the weight of their inevitability and congealing into one definitive, Avery. The Hollow Men had a new champion, and the world was plunged into an eternal night, right before his eyes. An invisible blanket yawned, rolling out like a heavy velvet carpet that startled no one engulfed by it. For the prey that was mankind did not have the bird's eye view of the hawk. A thick swirling dollop of shadow and despair filled the sky from every corner, stretched as far as the eyes could see. A giant monstrous bulging eye opening, sharp shining pitch lashes flaring, bubbles of light danced over the wet surface of its lens, as the iris stared down at its quarry, and trembled with glee. Avery, as the new consort of the Shadow Men, would be one of the few that knew the truth of this world. For it did not end with a bang or a commotion, but a whisper. The end of Act 3 of The Hollow Men of Badger's Drift. End of story. Thanks for listening. Please support my channel with a like and subscribe. Thank you.